It was a quiet evening. The air was cool and the streets were mostly empty as the woman drove home after a long day of work. She had been on her feet for hours, a job that demanded not only physical strength but mental sharpness. As a U.S. service officer, she had seen her fair share of challenges, from the chaos of intense situations to the quiet moments when she could finally breathe. But today had been especially tiring. She just wanted to get home, relax, and enjoy a few moments of peace before starting the cycle again. The sound of the engine was steady and calming as she navigated through the residential streets. The sun had set, and the streetlights cast long shadows along the sidewalks. Her eyes were tired, but she stayed focused on the road ahead. The radio hummed softly in the background, the music just enough to keep her alert but not too loud to be distracting. Everything was normal. Everything was calm. But then, as she passed an intersection, she saw the flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a police car. She had been pulled over many times before, but the experience was never easy. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to stay calm. She knew the drill. Turn off the engine, roll down the window, and wait for the officer to approach. As she sat there, she took a deep breath and reminded herself to stay calm. It wasn't the first time she had been pulled over, but there was something about this situation that felt different. Maybe it was the way the police car had come up behind her so quickly, or the way the sirens had blared so urgently. Whatever it was, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She watched in the rearview mirror as the officer stepped out of the car. He was tall, with a strong build and a purposeful stride. He seemed focused, almost stern, as he approached her vehicle. As he got closer, she could see the hard set of his jaw, the way his eyes were scanning her car. She didn't know what to expect, but she couldn't deny the uneasy feeling in her chest. Something about the officer made her feel like she was already guilty of something. When he reached the window, he didn't smile or greet her in a friendly manner. Instead, he stood there for a moment, looking down at her as though sizing her up. The silence between them stretched on for a few seconds, and she could feel the tension building. She wasn't sure what to say, so she just waited for him to speak first. "License and registration," he said sharply, his voice low and commanding. She nodded, her hands moving to the glove compartment to retrieve her documents. As she handed them to him, she noticed how the officer's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. There was something in his gaze, something that made her feel uncomfortable. It wasn't just that he was a cop doing his job. It felt different. It felt judgmental. The officer didn't say anything else as he took the papers from her and turned to walk back to his patrol car. She watched him go, her mind racing. What had that look been? What had made him so suspicious of her? Her thoughts were interrupted as the officer returned to her car. This time he didn't just ask for her documents. He started asking questions. Simple ones at first. Where was she coming from? Where was she going? But then his questions started to feel more invasive. Why was she driving alone? What was she doing out at this hour? Each question felt like another layer of suspicion, as though the officer was assuming the worst about her. She couldn't help but notice the way he spoke to her, like she wasn't just another driver, but someone who had done something wrong. As if her very presence in the driver's seat of her own car was cause for doubt. She knew she had to stay calm. She was no stranger to encounters with law enforcement, but this felt different. It wasn't just the questioning. It was the underlying tone of distrust. She was used to being judged by the color of her skin. It had happened all her life in small ways and big ways. But now, here she was, trying to stay composed in the face of an officer who seemed to see her as a threat before she had even said a word. The officer didn't seem to care that she was a U.S. service officer. He didn't know that she had dedicated her life to serving her country, protecting people and upholding the law. He didn't know that she had worked hard for every step she had taken in her career, that she had earned her position through years of sacrifice and determination. All he saw was a black woman in a car late at night. To him, that was enough reason to question her, to treat her with suspicion. She could feel the frustration building inside her. She wanted to say something, to speak up and tell him who she really was, but she also knew that speaking out too quickly could make things worse. She had been trained to handle difficult situations, but this felt different. There was something about this officer's attitude that made it hard to stay calm, hard to trust that this encounter would end without incident. "Are you carrying anything illegal in the vehicle?" the officer asked, his voice growing more forceful. The question took her by surprise. She wasn't sure if it was the way he asked or the fact that he had assumed she might be hiding something, but it felt like an attack. She was a service officer. She had sworn an oath to protect the country, to uphold the law, and here she was, being treated like a criminal. "No," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm not carrying anything illegal." The officer didn't seem satisfied with her answer. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. She could see that he didn't believe her, that he was still convinced there was something wrong, something off about this entire situation. At that moment, she realized that no matter what she said or did, it wouldn't be enough. This officer had already made up his mind about her. She could tell by the way he was acting, by the way he was treating her like someone to be questioned, someone to be watched. He didn't see her as a person. He saw her as a threat based on nothing more than the color of her skin. The longer the silence stretched, the more uncomfortable she felt. She wanted to say something to break the tension, to remind him that she was just another person trying to get home after a long day. But something told her that speaking up too quickly would only make things worse. Instead, she sat there, her hands clenched tightly on the steering wheel, trying to stay calm despite the growing anxiety in her chest. Finally, the officer turned and walked back to his patrol car. He didn't say anything else. He just walked away, leaving her to sit there in the quiet, the weight of the situation hanging heavily in the air. She couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind. Did he realize how much he had overstepped? Did he even care? As she waited for him to return, her mind raced with thoughts of the encounter. She had faced difficult situations before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about being pulled over. It was about the way she was treated, the way she was seen. And it made her question how much had really changed over the years. How much longer would she have to prove herself, to show that she was more than just the color of her skin? She didn't have the answers. All she knew was that she had to stay calm. She had to remain composed. Because in this moment, all she had was her own strength, her own ability to handle what was thrown her way, and that, for now, would have to be enough. The woman sat in her car, waiting, her mind racing. The officer had returned to his patrol car, and she could only imagine what he was doing. Running her information, checking for something that might give him an excuse to escalate the situation. She knew that in moments like these, anything could go wrong. She had seen it happen before, not just to herself, but to others. It was the way the world worked sometimes, but she wasn't just anyone. She wasn't going to let her guard down, not now, not in a moment like this. Her fingers tapped rhythmically on the steering wheel as she glanced around the quiet street. The soft hum of the engine was the only sound, and it only seemed to make the tension more palpable. The world outside felt distant, but in the car, in that small space, it felt like everything was closing in on her. She was trapped in a moment that could shape everything, a moment where she had to decide how she would respond, where she had to choose whether to rise above it or let it break her. The seconds seemed to stretch into minutes, and she wondered how long it would take for the officer to finish whatever it was he was doing. Part of her wanted to get out of the car and confront him, to ask him why he was treating her like this. But she knew better. She knew that doing so might make things worse. So instead, she stayed still, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, her body tense but not giving in to fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer returned to her window. His expression was unreadable, but his steps were heavy, his boots clicking on the pavement as he made his way back to her car. She didn't know what to expect. Would he apologize for his behavior, or would he continue to treat her with the same suspicion and hostility? "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice flat. "Step out of the car." Her heart dropped. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. The request seemed sudden, unnecessary. She hadn't done anything wrong. She knew her rights, and she had every right to remain in her car. But the way the officer had said it, the tone in his voice, felt like an order, not a request. Like he had already decided what was going to happen next. She looked up at him, her gaze steady but wary. "I'm not stepping, out of the car," she said firmly, her voice calm but resolute. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he simply stepped back, his hand resting on the side of his holster as if he were preparing for something. The gesture didn't go unnoticed. She felt her body tense even further. She knew that in a situation like this, everything could change in an instant. One wrong move, one misstep, and things could escalate beyond her control. She wasn't scared, not really. But she was careful, Cautious she had to be. She had learned over the years that being anything else could cost you more than you were willing to lose. The officer stood there for a moment, watching her, as if trying to gauge whether she would back down. But she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She knew that in situations like this you had to hold your ground. It was the only way to ensure that you weren't swallowed up by the tension, by the fear that could easily take hold in moments of uncertainty. Finally, the officer spoke again, though his tone was different now, less forceful but still sharp. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked. She could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. She could guess the reason. He probably thought she was speeding or driving erratically. But the real question was why he was making this stop so much more difficult than it needed to be. Why was he treating her like a criminal when she had done nothing wrong? "I wasn't speeding," she replied evenly. "I didn't break any laws." The officer didn't answer right away. He just stared at her, and for a brief moment the silence between them felt suffocating. He seemed to be considering his next move, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. But whatever he had been expecting, it wasn't this. She wasn't scared. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't giving him the reaction he had hoped for. Instead of responding immediately, the officer moved to the front of her car, looking at her license plate for a moment before returning to her window. She could see his mind working, his eyes scanning her car, her demeanor, the way she carried herself, but nothing in her appearance or her actions gave him an excuse to treat her this way. She was calm, composed. She had done everything by the book, and yet he didn't seem to believe her. He seemed to think that she was hiding something, that there was more to the story than what she was saying. His assumptions were clear in his eyes, in the way his posture shifted when he looked at her. He wasn't just doing his job anymore. He was making assumptions. He was judging her. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his voice colder now. "Work," she answered, keeping her voice steady. "I'm on my way home." He nodded as though that answer was somehow unsatisfactory. "And where do you live?" The question felt invasive, unnecessary. She could feel the frustration bubbling up inside her. She wasn't a suspect in a crime. She wasn't someone who needed to be questioned about her every move. She was just a woman driving home from work. But again she held her tongue. She had learned the hard way that sometimes saying less was better. "I live just a few miles from here," she replied simply. "I'm just trying to get home." The officer didn't respond to that. Instead, he took a step back, his gaze lingering on her. She could tell that he was still suspicious, still not convinced by anything she had said. He didn't believe her. To him, she was just another person to be watched, another person who didn't belong in a place of power, in a position like hers. At that moment, the woman felt a pang of frustration. It wasn't just the officer's questions. It wasn't just the way he had treated her. It was the way the world worked, how people judged her, how they assumed things about her because of her skin color. It had happened before. She had been underestimated her entire life, and this moment was just another reminder of how much further she had to go to prove herself. But she wasn't about to let him see that. She wasn't about to let him see how much his judgment hurt. So she kept her posture strong, kept her voice steady, even though inside everything felt like it was about to break. The officer glanced down at his clipboard for a moment, then looked back up at her. "You're not carrying anything illegal, are you?" It was an accusation more than a question, and the woman could feel the weight of it, the implication that somehow she was guilty of something even though she had done nothing wrong. She wasn't carrying anything illegal. She wasn't a criminal, but in that moment she realized that none of that mattered to him. "No," she said again, her voice tight with frustration but still controlled. "I'm not carrying anything illegal." The officer didn't seem satisfied by her response. His eyes narrowed once more as he looked at her, and the woman could see the judgment in his gaze. He wasn't just doubting her words. He was doubting her entire existence, doubting her right to be there, to be in that car, to be in the position she had earned. And that was when it hit her, the weight of the situation, the unfairness of it all. She wasn't just being pulled over. She was being judged. And no matter how much she told him she hadn't done anything wrong, he had already decided who she was. And in his mind, she was already guilty. The silence stretched on again as the officer continued to look at her, his gaze cold and assessing. She had no idea what he was thinking, but it didn't matter. She had learned long ago that people like him wouldn't change. She could fight, she could argue, but it wouldn't change how he saw her. So, Instead, she chose to stay silent, choosing her words carefully, knowing that no matter how much she spoke, the conversation wouldn't change. She would just have to wait for this to be over, knowing that she had done nothing wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officer turned and walked back to his car. He didn't say anything else. He just walked away, leaving her to sit there in the quiet of the night. As she sat there waiting for the officer to return with whatever decision he had made, she couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The world had a way of testing people like her. It had a way of making them prove themselves over and over again. But she wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. And no matter what happened next, she would stand firm. The minutes dragged on like hours, and as the officer walked back to his patrol car, the woman couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settle in her chest. Every time he left, every time the distance between them grew, she felt like she could finally take a deep breath. But the relief was always short-lived. It was as if the calm moments in between were just the prelude to something worse, to an outcome she couldn't control. She stared out of the windshield, her eyes blank, her thoughts racing. Her mind wandered back to the countless times she had been in situations where she had been judged because of her skin. It wasn't new to her, this feeling of being scrutinized, of having her every move questioned, her every word doubted. But even so, it always hit her in ways she couldn't prepare for. She was a service officer. She had served her country, put her life on the line for it, and yet here she was, being treated like someone who couldn't even be trusted to drive home without suspicion. She wondered what he had been doing back at his car. Had he been running her information? Had he been searching for something to justify his behavior? Was he looking for a reason to arrest her, or was he simply trying to figure out what to do next? Every second felt like a game of waiting, a game where the rules were never clear and the outcome was never certain. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the officer returned to her car. This time he wasn't holding her documents. Instead, his hand rested at his side, his fingers tapping on the car door as he glanced at her. She could feel the shift in the air. Something was different now. There was a hesitation in his movements, a shift in his posture that made her wonder if he had come to some sort of realization. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, as if the weight of the entire encounter was sitting heavily on both of their shoulders. The officer seemed to be searching for something to say, but words didn't seem to come easily. She didn't speak either. She had learned long ago that in moments like this, silence could be more powerful than anything else. The officer cleared his throat. "I've run your information," he said, his voice still distant but with a slight shift in tone, almost as if he were trying to sound more neutral. "You're not in any trouble." The words were simple enough, but they didn't bring the relief she had hoped for. They didn't erase the tension that still lingered in the air. They didn't take away the feeling that she was being judged based on something she couldn't control. She didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded, acknowledging the officer's words but not letting go of the frustration that had been building inside her. She didn't care if he had run her information. She didn't care if everything came back clean. The point was that he had treated her like a criminal from the very beginning, and no piece of paper was going to change that. The officer continued, as if he were trying to explain himself. "You have a clean record," he said, his voice slightly softer now. "But I still need to ask you to step out of the vehicle." The request hit her like a punch in the stomach. She could feel her pulse quicken, the familiar feeling of anger rising in her chest. It didn't matter that he had just told her she wasn't in any trouble. He had already decided to treat her like someone who needed to be controlled, someone who needed to be questioned more. Deeply. She took a breath, trying to keep her composure. "I'm not stepping out of the car," she said firmly, her voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer hesitated, his eyes flickering to her for a moment before looking down at the ground. For a split second, she saw something shift in him, something that might have been doubt, but he quickly masked it, covering it up with his usual authoritative stance. "I need you to step out, ma'am," he said. The words clipped as though this was no longer a request but an order. Her heart raced, and for the first time in a long time she felt the old familiar fear creeping in. But she wasn't about to let it control her. She wasn't about to let him take her power away. "I'm not stepping out," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "I've done nothing wrong." "You have no reason to ask me to step out." The officer's jaw clenched. She could see the frustration building in his eyes, the way his hands tightened around his belt. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, and it made him uncomfortable. It made him angry, but she wasn't backing down. She knew her rights. She knew what she was entitled to. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like it could suffocate them both. She could feel the officer's eyes on her, could feel the weight of his judgment, but she refused to look away. She refused to show any sign of weakness. Then, without warning, the officer let out a sigh and stepped back. "Fine," he muttered, his voice full of frustration. "But I'm going to give you a citation for your records." The word stung. The citation was just another way for him to assert control, to make her feel like she was guilty of something. But she wouldn't let him win. She wouldn't let him make her feel small. "Do what you need to do," she said, her voice firm. "But I'm not stepping out of the car." The officer glared at her for a moment longer before turning to walk back to his patrol car. She watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She had held her ground. She had refused to be intimidated. But she knew that this moment wasn't over. She knew that whatever came next would have its own set of challenges. As the officer returned to his car, she thought about everything that had happened. She thought about the way he had treated her, about the way he had assumed things about her from the very beginning. She thought about how, no matter how many times she proved herself, there would always be someone like him, someone who would look at her and see only the color of her skin. The officer was still sitting in his car, typing something into his computer. She could see the light from the screen reflecting on his face, casting a pale glow in the darkened night. He seemed to be focused on something, and for a brief moment she let herself relax. Maybe this was it. Maybe it was finally over. But she knew better than to let her guard down completely. There was always the possibility that something else could happen, that the officer could change his mind, that he could escalate things even further. She sat there in the car, her mind running through all the possibilities, all the things that could go wrong. She thought about the countless people who had been in situations like this, people who hadn't been so lucky, people who hadn't been able to stand their ground, people who had been caught in a system that didn't care about them, a system that treated them like criminals before they had even done anything wrong. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let herself become just another statistic, just another person whose story was lost in the noise. She had worked too hard to get where she was. To let someone take that from her, she wouldn't let it happen. Minutes passed, and the officer finally emerged from his car, walking back to her with the citation in hand. He handed it to her without a word, his eyes avoiding hers. She took it, holding it in her hands without saying anything. She could feel the weight of the paper, the weight of the entire situation, but she wouldn't let it break her. She wouldn't let it define her. The officer didn't say anything else. He simply turned and walked back to his patrol car. She watched him go, her heart still racing, her thoughts still in turmoil. But as he drove away, she let out a long breath. She had survived it. She had stood her ground, and that was all that mattered. As the officer's car pulled away, the woman sat in her vehicle, staring at the citation in her hands. The tension that had filled the air moments ago slowly started to dissipate, but it didn't completely fade. The weight of the situation lingered, not just because of the citation, but because of the way she had been treated. She had done nothing wrong, yet she had been questioned, judged, and made to feel like a suspect. It wasn't just the citation that stung. It was the unfairness of the entire encounter. She could feel the anger building inside her again, but she kept it in check. She had learned over the years that losing control in moments like these only made things worse. So instead of letting the frustration take over, she focused on breathing deeply, calming herself, and trying to make sense of what had just happened. The officer had made it clear that he didn't believe her, didn't trust her. No matter what her identification said, no matter what her record showed, she was still a black woman in his eyes, a person to be watched, a person who couldn't be trusted. That much had been obvious from the very beginning. It wasn't just about this encounter. It was about the underlying assumption that people like her didn't belong, didn't deserve the same respect as others. But she wasn't going to let him define her. She wasn't going to let this officer or anyone else decide who she was. She knew who she was. She had spent years proving herself, working tirelessly to build a career to earn the respect of her peers. She had fought for every step she had taken in life, and she wasn't about to let someone take that away from her with a simple traffic stop. Still, the sting of the encounter remained. It was hard to shake the feeling of being diminished, of being treated like she was less than, simply because of who she was. She was used to it, yes, but that didn't mean it was easy to swallow. It didn't mean it didn't hurt. Every time something like this happened, it reminded her of how much further she still had to go to break through the layers of prejudice and bias that were still deeply ingrained in society. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had been in her shoes, how many others had been treated the same way, judged by the color of their skin instead of who they truly were. She thought about the countless stories she had heard from friends, family, and colleagues, stories of being pulled over for no reason, of being questioned simply for existing in spaces where others believed they didn't belong. It wasn't a new experience for her, but it still felt like a punch to the gut every time. As she drove away, the quiet of the night seemed almost too loud. She could still feel the tension in her body, still feel the rush of emotions that she had tried so hard to keep in check. She wanted to scream, to shout out how unfair it all was, but she knew that wouldn't help. She knew that getting angry, letting the emotions take control, wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't change how the world saw her, or how people like that officer would continue to treat her. But even as she struggled to make sense of everything, a small part of her felt a sense of pride. She had stood her ground. She had refused to let him push her around to make her feel less than. She had faced that officer's hostility with strength and composure, and in the end, she had walked away with her dignity intact. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And sometimes, in a world that seemed to constantly push back against her, that small victory was all she needed to keep going. The road ahead seemed longer now, as if the drive home had become a journey, not just in distance, but in everything she had just experienced. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the officer, the way he had looked at her, the way he had treated her like a criminal before he even knew who she was. She couldn't shake the feeling of being targeted, of being watched simply because of the color of her skin. It was a feeling she had become all too familiar with, but it was still one that never failed to leave her feeling raw. As she passed through the quiet streets, her mind started to wander to the bigger picture. She thought about her work, her life, and the struggles she faced on a daily basis. She had always known that life wouldn't be easy for her. She had always known that she would face challenges that others might never have to face. But she had never expected this kind of thing to happen. She had never expected to be treated with such disregard, such suspicion, simply because of who she was. She thought about her colleagues, other officers who had fought alongside her, who had supported her throughout her career. She had always believed that the bond they shared, the respect they had for one another, transcended any differences in background or appearance. But moments like this made her question everything. If even an officer could treat her this way, what about the rest of the world? How much of the respect she had earned was real, and how much of it was just a facade? Despite these thoughts, she reminded herself that this was just one moment in time. It didn't define her. It didn't take away all the hard work she had done, or the respect she had earned from the people who mattered. She had faced challenges before and she had overcome them. This would be no different. She would move forward, even if it meant carrying the weight of this moment with her for a little while longer. When she finally reached home, the weight of the encounter seemed to lift just a little. She parked the car, took a deep breath, and sat there for a moment. The quiet of the night was soothing, a stark contrast to the tension she had just endured. She thought about the home she had built for herself, the life she had created, and the people who truly knew her for who she was. They saw her for her dedication, her strength, her resilience. They didn't see her as the officer had. They didn't see her as a threat. And for that, she was grateful. She stepped out of the car, locking the door behind her, and walked toward her front door. As she did, she couldn't help but think back to everything that had happened. It wasn't just about the officer. It was about something much bigger. It was about the systems in place that allowed people to be treated this way, simply because of the color of their skin. It was about the invisible barriers that existed, the ones that kept people like her from fully being seen, fully being respected. But she wasn't going to let that stop her. She couldn't. She had come too far, fought too hard to let this moment define her. The officer might have seen her as a threat, but she knew who she was. She knew what she had accomplished, what she had overcome, and what she still had left to achieve. She would keep moving forward, no matter how many obstacles were in her way. As she entered her home, she let out a breath she didn't even know she had been holding. The door clicked shut behind her, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to be still. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. She would be ready. No matter what. The night passed in a haze of thoughts and emotions, and as the woman sat in her living room staring out of the window, the events of the evening replayed in her mind. The officer's face, his cold eyes, and the way he had treated her, every detail was burned into her memory. But as much as she wanted to let the anger take hold, as much as she wanted to let it consume her, she couldn't. She had learned long ago that harboring anger for too long only made her more exhausted. It only weighed her down. So she sat there, letting the stillness of her home offer her some comfort. The quiet was soothing after the chaos of what had just happened. It was a reminder that she was in control here. In her own space, no one could judge her. No one could make her feel small. Here, she was in charge of her own life. But even in the quiet of her home, she couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. The officer had not just questioned her actions. He had questioned her worth. He had made assumptions about her because of her skin color, and no matter how much she tried to push the anger aside, it kept creeping back in. It was always there, waiting to remind her of the world she lived in, the world where, no matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she achieved, some people would always see her as less. She knew it wasn't just about the officer. It wasn't just about this one moment in time. It was about the larger system of prejudice that existed in the world. It was about the countless people who had faced the same judgment, the same assumptions, and the same discrimination. It was about the invisible barriers that were built into society, the ones that kept people like her from being seen for who they truly were. But as the night wore on, the woman realized that she couldn't let this experience define her. She had already spent so much of her life proving herself to the world, trying to break through the barriers that had been placed in her path. She had worked too hard to let this one moment, this one officer's actions change who she was or how she viewed herself. She was tired, yes, tired of fighting battles that she shouldn't have to fight, tired of proving herself over and over again. But she was also strong. She had proven that to herself time and time again. She had gotten to where she was because of her perseverance, her hard work, and her refusal to let the world tell her who she was. The officer's behavior hadn't shaken her to the core. It had just reminded her of the realities of the world she lived in. But she wasn't going to let it take away her sense of self. She wasn't going to let it make her feel like she didn't belong, like she was unworthy. She knew her worth. She had always known it, even when others tried to make her doubt herself. The woman stood up and walked over to the kitchen. The familiar sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, were a reminder of the life she had built. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. It was a life that she had created with her own hands, and nothing, not even an officer's judgment, could take that away from her. She made herself a cup of tea, something to help calm her nerves, to bring her some peace after the tumult of the evening. As she sat down at the kitchen table, she let the warmth of the tea seep into her hands, grounding her in the present moment. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how to change the world, how to erase the prejudices that still existed, but she did know this. She couldn't give up. She couldn't stop fighting for the life she had built, for the respect she deserved. The officer had tried to make her feel small, but he had failed. She was still standing. She was still moving forward. And no matter what the world threw at her, she would keep going, because that was what she had always done. As she sat there, the weight of the situation started to lift. It wasn't gone entirely, but it no longer consumed her. She had found a way to let go of some of the anger, some of the frustration. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, it was about choosing not to let it control her. The woman knew that this experience, like so many others before it, would stay with her. She would carry it with her, not as a burden, but as a reminder that no matter how far she had come, the world still had a long way to go. But it was also a reminder that she was strong enough to face it, to keep moving forward even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. She had faced adversity her whole life, and she had come out stronger for it. This moment was no different. She wasn't going to let it break her. She wasn't going to let it change who she was or how she saw the world. She was a woman of strength, of resilience, and she would continue to rise above whatever challenges came her way. The next day, as the woman went about her routine, she found herself thinking about the encounter again, but this time it didn't feel like a weight on her chest. It didn't feel like something she had to carry with her. Instead, it felt like something she had already overcome, something that had already been put in the past. She had learned something from that night, not just about the officer, but about herself. She had learned that her worth wasn't determined by how others saw her. It wasn't determined by the color of her skin or by the assumptions people made about her. Her worth was determined by what she had accomplished, by the way she carried herself, by the way she treated others. She knew who she was, and nothing could change that. The woman thought about the future. She thought about the challenges that still lay ahead, but she didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel uncertain. She knew that she had the strength to face whatever came her way. She had faced down prejudice, she had faced down adversity, and she had come out on top. Nothing in this world could take that away from her. And so as she moved forward, she did so with a sense of purpose, with a sense of pride in who she was and what she had achieved. She knew that the road ahead would not always be easy, but she also knew that she was capable of handling whatever challenges came her way. The officer, the citation, the judgment, none of it defined her. What defined her was her strength, her resilience, and her ability to rise above. The world might not always see her for who she truly was, but she saw herself. And that was enough. That would always be enough. The next morning, as the woman woke up to the first light of the day, she felt a sense of clarity that hadn't been there the night before. The events of the previous evening were still fresh in her mind, but they didn't weigh as heavily on her anymore. It was like a fog had lifted, leaving her with a clearer perspective. She had come to terms with what had happened, and in doing so she had found a new sense of strength. She stretched her arms above her head, feeling the stretch in her muscles, and then rolled out of bed. There was something calming about the routine of mornings, the predictability of it, the quiet moments before the world fully woke up. It was in these moments that she could gather herself, prepare for whatever the day might throw her way. As she moved through her morning routine, she reflected on the night before. She had faced judgment, hostility, and suspicion from someone who didn't know her, someone who hadn't taken the time to see her for who she truly was. But that was their failure, not hers. She had done everything right. She had kept her composure when it would have been easy to react out of anger. She had stood her ground, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of assumptions and prejudice. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. It was about every person who had been judged based on their appearance, their background, or where they came from. She had been fortunate enough to be in a position where she could handle moments like these. But not everyone had that luxury. Not everyone had the ability to walk away with their dignity intact. And that thought made her even more determined to keep fighting to key. Pushing forward, she finished getting ready, grabbing a quick breakfast before heading out. The morning light felt different today, brighter somehow. Maybe it was because she had taken control of her emotions. Maybe because she had learned something important about herself. Whatever the reason, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her the night before. As she drove to work, the streets seemed quieter than usual. She didn't know if it was the early hour or if the world around her was just settling into its own rhythm, but for the first time in a while she felt calm, centered, like she had finally found some balance between the anger she had felt and the determination that had always driven her. She thought about the officer again, but not with anger. This time she thought about him with a certain detachment. She realized that he had been a product of his own experiences, his own biases. He had chosen to see her through the lens of those biases, and there was nothing she could do to change that. But she didn't need him to see her. She didn't need him to recognize her worth. She already knew her worth, and that was enough. Her thoughts shifted to her work, to the things that truly mattered. She had always found purpose in her career, in the people she worked with, in the lives she had touched along the way. It wasn't just about the job. It was about making a difference, about showing up every day and doing the best she could no matter what. When she arrived at work, the usual buzz of activity surrounded her. The office was busy, people talking, phones ringing, papers shuffling. It was a familiar sound, one that had always been comforting to her. It was in these moments, in the hustle and bustle of the workday, that she felt most herself. She thrived in the chaos, in the constant movement, because it meant that she was doing something important. As she settled into her desk, her mind wandered to the people she worked with, people who truly saw her, who respected her for the work she did, not for anything else. They didn't care about her background or where she came from. They cared about the person she was right now in this moment. They knew what she was capable of and they respected her for it. But there was one person she couldn't stop thinking about. Her colleague, the one who had always believed in her. This person had seen her struggle, had watched her face challenges that no one else understood. They had always been there to offer a word of encouragement, to remind her of her strength when she doubted herself. Their belief in her had never wavered, and in a way it had kept her going through some of her toughest moments. She made a mental note to check in with them later in the day. It was good to have people in your corner, people who had your back even when the world outside seemed to be against you. She was grateful for that. As the day wore on, she found herself moving through the tasks at hand with a sense of purpose. The usual challenges cropped up, difficult clients, unexpected issues that needed solving, but she handled them with ease. It was as though the events of the previous night had sharpened her focus, given her a new sense of clarity. She wasn't going to let anything distract her from what mattered. At lunch, she stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. The sun was high in the sky, and there was a slight breeze that made the day feel perfect. She stood there for a moment, closing her eyes and letting the warmth of the sun wash over her. It felt good to be outside, to be alive. It was a reminder that, despite the challenges, there was still so much to be grateful for. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back to reality. It was a message from her colleague, the one she had been thinking about earlier. "Hey, I wanted to check in. How are you doing today?" The message brought a small smile to her face. She typed a quick reply, letting them know she was doing well. It felt good to know that someone cared, that someone was checking in even in the midst of everything else. After lunch, the rest of the day flew by. It wasn't until the evening, as she was packing up to leave, that the weight of the day hit her again. The events from last night, the officer's behavior, all the emotions she had tried to push aside, they all came rushing back. But this time it wasn't as overwhelming. This time she had the perspective she needed to handle it. As she walked out of the office, she felt a sense of resolve. The world wasn't perfect. She knew that. But she also knew that she had the power to shape her own path. She had the power to decide who she was and how she would respond to the challenges she faced. The officer's actions hadn't broken her, and they never would. They were just another obstacle to overcome, another moment that would eventually fade into the past. What mattered was how she moved forward, how she continued to show up for herself and for the people who mattered. That evening, as she returned home, she found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. It wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about the strength she had found within herself, the determination to keep pushing forward despite the obstacles in her path. She wasn't going to let anyone define her. She wasn't going to let anyone take away the sense of self-worth that she had worked so hard to build. As she sat down on the couch and took a deep breath, she felt a sense of peace. She wasn't perfect. She had flaws just like everyone else. But she was strong. She was capable. And that was all she needed to be. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be more challenges, more people who would try to bring her down. But she knew one thing for sure: she would keep going. She would keep moving forward no matter what. And with that thought, she settled in for the night, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. Because she knew that no matter what happened, she was enough. She was always enough. The following days unfolded much like any other, but there was something different in the air. The woman felt as though she had moved past the frustration and anger from that night. The officer's actions still lingered in her mind, but they no longer held the power they once did. She had made peace with the situation, or at least, she had learned how to live with it. She woke up each morning, went through her routine, and did her best to keep a positive outlook. She didn't want the negative energy from one encounter to control her life. It had taken a lot to get to where she was, and no matter what happened, she wouldn't let anyone or anything take away that sense of progress. Her work was busy, but in a good way. She was busy because she was successful, because people trusted her judgment, and because her hard work was finally paying off. There were always challenges, but nothing that was too big to handle. She worked with a strong team of colleagues, people who respected her for what she brought to the table, and that made all the difference. It was easy to focus on the good when she was surrounded by people who appreciated her. But as the days passed, there were moments when the weight of everything came crashing back. She couldn't escape the fact that there were still people out there, like that officer who saw her as less than. It wasn't just about the way he treated her. It was about how many others had likely experienced the same thing. How many others were still fighting the same fight, day in and day out. She thought about it often, especially when she saw stories in the news or heard about people who had gone through similar experiences. It made her wonder how many others had been treated the same way, how many had been made to feel small, like they didn't matter. It was a harsh reality, one that she could never fully escape, no matter how much progress she made in her own life. The world was still full of people who judged others based on things they couldn't control. But there was one thing she had learned. She couldn't change those people. She couldn't control how others saw her, no matter how much she wanted to. What she could control was how she responded, how she carried herself in the face of adversity. And she had learned to respond with grace, with dignity, and with strength. She had learned not to let the actions of others dictate her worth. There were still moments when she felt frustrated, when she wanted to scream and shout about how unfair everything was, but those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Instead of allowing herself to be weighed down by anger, she focused on the positive. She focused on the people who did see her, who did recognize her worth, and who treated her with the respect she deserved. One evening, as she sat in her living room after a long day at work, she found herself thinking about the future. She was still determined to keep moving forward, to keep pushing for a better life, a better world. She had never been one to settle for mediocrity, and she wasn't about to start now. Her thoughts drifted to the people she had met along the way, people who had supported her, people who had given her the strength to keep going. She thought about her family, her friends, her colleagues, the ones who believed in her when no one else did. They were the ones who kept her grounded, who reminded her of her worth when the world seemed to be telling her otherwise. She thought about the officer again, but this time, it wasn't with anger or bitterness. It was with understanding. She understood now that his actions had come from a place of ignorance, a place of preconceived notions that he had likely never questioned. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it gave her a sense of peace knowing that it wasn't personal. He hadn't known her, hadn't taken the time to see the person she truly was. And that was his loss, not hers. She let out a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past fee. Days began to lift. She had learned something valuable from the experience, something that would stay with her for the rest of her life. She had learned that no one could define her but herself. She had learned that no matter what anyone else thought, no matter how others treated her, she had the power to decide who she was and how she would move forward. It was a lesson that she had learned the hard way, but it was one she would never forget. And as she sat there reflecting on everything that had happened, she realized that she had come out stronger for it. The officer's actions, the moments of judgment, the feelings of being underestimated, they had all pushed her to be better, to rise above, and to keep fighting for what she deserved. But she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated like they didn't matter. Everyone who had ever been judged based on something beyond their control. She was fighting for change, for a world where no one was made to feel small because of their skin color, their background, or their appearance. It was a long road ahead, but she was ready for it. The days continued to pass, and with each one she felt a little bit lighter. She was no longer carrying the burden of that encounter with the officer. It had become just another chapter in her story, another part of her journey. And while it was a painful chapter, it was also one that had taught her a lot about herself and about the world around her. She was still learning, still growing, but she was no longer afraid. She was no longer afraid of the challenges that lay ahead. She was no longer afraid of the people who would try to tear her down. She had faced them before and she would face them again, but she wasn't alone in this fight. She had the support of those who truly mattered, and that made all the difference. As she looked toward the future, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had a clear vision of what she wanted for her life, and she was determined to make it happen. She was going to keep pushing forward, keep striving for the life she deserved, and keep fighting for the world she wanted to see. And no one, not even the officer from that night, could take that away from her. The world may have tried to define her, but she had defined herself. She had proven that she was more than the labels others tried to place on her. She was strong, she was capable, and she was ready for whatever came next. The road ahead might be long, but she was ready to walk it step by step, with her head held high. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, she continued on her journey, confident in the knowledge that no matter what happened, she was enough. She had always been enough. As the weeks turned into months, the woman found herself settling into a new rhythm. Her days were filled with the usual responsibilities, work, errands, and moments of quiet reflection. But there was something different now. Something had shifted inside her, a sense of strength and purpose that was more powerful than ever before. The challenges of the past had become lessons, not burdens, and she carried them with a quiet confidence that had grown stronger with time. She had always known that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but now she felt more equipped to handle whatever came her way. The officer's actions, though painful, had sparked a deeper understanding of herself and the world around her. It was as if the experience had stripped away the layers of doubt and fear, leaving her with a clarity that allowed her to see things from a different perspective. Every day, as she walked into the office, she was reminded of the progress she had made. She had worked her way up through hard work and determination, and her success wasn't just about the title she held. It was about the respect she had earned from those who truly saw her for who she was. Her colleagues admired her not just for her skills but for her integrity, her unwavering dedication to doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. But even as she thrived in her professional life, there were moments when the weight of the world outside threatened to creep back in. The system of prejudice that she had faced was still there, lingering just beneath the surface, and every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of it, whether in the form of a passing glance, a dismissive comment, or an assumption made based on her appearance. It was a constant reminder that the world was still full of biases and judgment, and that even the most determined person couldn't escape them completely. But she didn't let those moments define her. Instead, she used them as fuel to keep moving forward, to keep fighting for change. She had already made the decision that she would not allow anyone or anything to dictate her worth, and every day she reaffirmed that choice. She was more than just the color of her skin, or the assumptions that people might make about her. She was a person of value, someone who had earned every step she had taken. One afternoon, as she was working late in the office, she received an email from an old colleague. They had been in touch occasionally over the years, but this email was different. The subject line read, "Reaching out for advice." She clicked on the message, intrigued, and began reading. The email was from someone she had known during her early years in the field. They had both started at the same time, and although their paths had diverged over the years, they had always kept in touch. The tone of the email was different, though. It was filled with a sense of vulnerability that she hadn't expected. The colleague explained that they had recently encountered some challenges in their own career. They felt overlooked, dismissed, and unsure of how to move forward. They were seeking advice from someone they trusted, someone who had navigated similar struggles. The woman sat back in her chair for a moment, letting the words sink in. She thought about everything she had gone through, about the officer, about the moments of doubt, about the struggles she had faced along the way. She thought about how she had kept pushing forward, even when it felt like the world was pushing back against her. She knew what she needed to do. She began typing a response offering words of encouragement and advice. She reminded her colleague that setbacks were a natural part of the journey, that they didn't define a person's worth or potential. She shared some of the lessons she had learned along the way, about standing firm in the face of adversity, about finding strength in moments of struggle, and about never allowing others' judgment to dictate who you were. As she wrote, she realized how far she had come. It wasn't just about what she had accomplished in her career. It was about the wisdom she had gained along the way, the resilience she had developed through each challenge she had faced. She wasn't the same person she had been when she started. She was stronger, more confident, and more sure of herself than ever before. She hit send on the email, feeling a sense of pride in the advice she had offered. It was a reminder that her journey wasn't just about her own growth. It was also about helping others along the way. She had a responsibility to share what she had learned. to offer support to those who were struggling, just as others had supported her. Later that evening, she received a response from her colleague, thanking her for the advice and expressing gratitude for the words of encouragement. It felt good to know that she had made a difference, that her experiences and the lessons she had learned could help someone else. It was a small moment, but it was one that filled her with a deep sense of fulfillment. As the days passed, she continued to reflect on her journey. She thought about how far she had come, about all the obstacles she had overcome, and about the lessons she had learned along the way. She had always known that life wasn't about avoiding challenges. It was about facing them head-on, learning from them, and growing stronger in the process. And that was exactly what she had done. But even as she reflected on her achievements, she knew that there was still work to be done. There was still change to be made, still progress to be fought for. The world wasn't perfect, and there were still too many people who faced the same biases and prejudices she had. But she was determined to keep pushing, to keep striving for a better future, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of who they were. She found herself thinking about the officer again, about how different things could have been if he had taken the time to see her for who she truly was. What if he had listened, really listened, instead of making assumptions based on his own biases? What if he had taken a moment to understand the person sitting in front of him, rather than judging her based on the color of her skin? She realized that in the end it wasn't about him or his actions. It was about her response. It was about how she chose to move forward, how she chose to rise above the negativity and keep striving for the life she deserved. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future, and that was exactly what she intended to do. As the days went by, she continued to focus on her work, her relationships, and her own growth. She surrounded herself with people who lifted her up, who supported her, and who saw her for who she truly was. She made time for the things that mattered, the moments of joy, the people who brought light into her life, and the experiences that helped her continue growing. And even as she faced new challenges, she did so with a sense of strength and purpose. She knew that life wasn't always going to be easy, but she also knew that she had the tools to handle whatever came her way. She had already faced so much, and she had come out stronger for it. As she looked toward the future, she felt hopeful. The road ahead might still be difficult, but she was ready for it. She had proven to herself that she could overcome anything. She had found the strength within herself to rise above the challenges, to learn from the setbacks, and to continue moving forward. The officer's actions, once so painful, had become just another part of her story, an experience that had shaped her but didn't define her. She was more than that moment, more than the way others might see her. She was a person of strength, of resilience, and of purpose, and that was something no one could take away. As the months turned into years, she continued to move forward, confident in her ability to handle whatever life threw her way. She knew that there would always be obstacles, but she also knew that she was strong enough to face them. She had faced the hardest challenges and come out on top, and no matter what happened next, she would keep going, because she knew deep down that she was enough. She had always been enough.